So Matt Schmucker, we are in Los Angeles, and we are at Radius Missiology Conference. We find ourselves in the same state, which doesn't happen a whole lot.
It doesn't.
And it's a special treat to be with you here in LA.
Privilege to be with you.
So Matt, you may be one of the best platform builders in American evangelicalism, as far as I know. So I would like for you to tell us about that. Tell us about what you do as kind of the man behind the scenes, for those who don't know.
I helped get 9 Marks started and off the ground and ran that for 11, 12 years. In the middle of that, we started something called Together for the Gospel, or T4G, and we ran that for about 18 years. In the middle of that, we started something called Cross, which is a student missions conference aimed at 18 to 25-year-olds. And that's still ongoing. And now I've started a new project called Good Churches, which we'll get into. So I'm a starter of many things and finisher of few.
Yeah, there you go. I've noticed, though, as you're starting projects, most of these aren't 1 to 2 year projects. I think you're at 18 years in there, and a lot of those are in the teens. So what would you say for you helps you start projects that last for a measure of time? How have you gotten to that space where you start projects that matter and that last for a bit?
Honestly, I'm less concerned about how long they last and more concerned about how they finish. A quote that I keep on my phone is, it goes, every great cause starts out as a mission, turns into a business, and ends up as a racket. And we see that throughout history. We see universities and organizations that just, they exist so they exist, and we fundraise so we can all keep our jobs, and they've lost the founder's original purpose. So I'm concerned that things come to an end and they remain faithful. So that's what I'm watching, not so much longevity, but that they end well.
I'd like to talk about that in a minute. We'll get to the racket piece, because that's fascinating. And certainly no founder of any organization or any movement wants to see their organization end in a racket, but I'd like to talk about that in a minute. Now, before we get to that, tell us about your family, about where you're from.
I'm married to Elizabeth. We call her Eli. We live in D.C. We've been there the last 30 years. We have 5 children, 1 boy and 4 girls, and now we're the proud grandparents of 7 boys and 2 girls.
There you go.
Yeah.
So a lot of daughters and a lot of grandsons.
Yes.
If you balance the scales.
And I'm one of 7 sons, so my life's kind of going boy, girl, boy. So.
Okay. And Schmucker is German.
It's
right?
German. Grew up in Pennsylvania. Didn't know I had a funny last name until I left the state.
Okay, and no sisters.
No.
Okay, so talk to us just briefly about growing up as one of 7 boys in a German family. Like, for those of us that didn't grow up in that environment, which is like everyone else, what was that like, the culture in your family growing up?
Well, it's a tough combination of Roman Catholic and then all boy. It was just a rough and tumble, works-oriented, you haven't done anything today, kind of like get up, get moving, push hard. So it was a very driven home. My father was a very driven man, and he taught us, not a believer when he passed, sadly, nor my mother, to the best of my knowledge. But I look back gratefully in a couple of different ways. Most importantly, probably the idea that he taught us how to work and even enjoy work. And that's sadly, I think, maybe lost on some families, and has served us sons very well.
Well, it's a great gift that your father gave to you and your brothers.
Yeah.
All right, so today we're talking about why is missions messy? So we think about...
I do not know.
You have no idea.
I don't know.
How can be done? So in some sense, we don't know either, but we're really trying to think about the messiness in missions, and the reason we call it messy is for a couple reasons. We think missions is filled with hard to solve problems, like all the easy problems have already been solved, so the ones that remain are a bit messy. We also believe that not everyone agrees on how to do it, which makes it messy.
That's for sure.
So not everyone who's involved in missions is not in the same room nodding heads saying, yes, that's exactly how to do it. In fact,
not only do they not agree, but then they even attack each other.
When they disagree.
That's right.
And
and that's just really unhelpful.
Which creates a lot of the messiness.
Yeah.
And then I think the third piece is it's difficult to measure effectiveness in missions. There's often this nebulous set of measurables that speak to what we would deem effectiveness, But at the end of the day, those may or may not speak to true effectiveness in missions. And so it seems like those are the things that cause this messiness in missions. So I'd like to talk through that today with you. And the first thing I want to start with is cross-conference. So over the last 10 years or so, you helped launch a conference called CrossCon that is about 18 to 25-year-olds getting in the room and learning about God's heart for the nations, the church, the gospel, missions, and how they can be involved. So as we think about messy missions problems, and we'll unpack the problem behind that in a minute, but can you just tell us about the history of CrossCon? Why did it need to get started? And tell us about where it's come in the last 10 years or so.
I mean, everything that I've done, 9 Marks, T4G, Cross, comes out of a need that's not being met. And so Cross, we were at the T4G 2012 conference. We're gathered there as speakers, and that's who I'm managing. And
which is 11 years ago.
Yeah, and so we're in the last session. I'm sitting next to Mark Dever, John Piper, and all these guys are to my right. And Mark leans over to me and says, "Do you want to come to a meeting and talk about a new conference for student missions?" And I said, "No."
No, thank you.
He's like, "Why?" I said, "Because I've got 12,000 people behind me and we got to shut down this conference." So they go off, have their meeting. Kevin DeYoung calls me a couple months later and says, "Well, we had our meeting at T4G and we really want to start a new conference." I said, "Well, tell me why." He said, "Well, we've been talking for years that we're concerned about the state of student missions conferences. There was one famous one that's gone for the last 50 plus years. And just like I said earlier, it started out faithful and ends up as something other than, it's a reverse witness now." And that just broke our hearts because so many of those men, John Piper attended this conference in, I think, 1968 and kind of cut his mission's teeth on that conference. And these other men just learned so much from those faithful men and women who were teaching at that conference. And it was just, we couldn't send our young people there anymore. So they said, "Let's start a new conference." So Piper gathered a bunch of us up in Minneapolis in the fall of 2012. DeYoung was there, David Platt was there, others, good missionary guys, Max Stiles, Zane Pratt, and John came ready. He came with a statement of faith. He said, "This is what I want. This is what I want the heart and soul to be for our conference." And then he had these values listed out, sorrowful yet always rejoicing. He didn't want jokes and silliness. And he's like, "This is a deadly serious problem and task." And he said, "The tone of this conference needs to be serious, sorrowful yet always rejoicing. We care about all suffering, but particularly eternal suffering." And man, he was fired up and he said, "Let's go."
Yeah. So at what point did they decide that you would be in charge of leading the planning for this conference?
Well, they saw what my work with T4G and figured I could handle a crowd. And John came ready with the statement of faith. I came ready with finances and budgets and what was it going to take staff-wise to get this thing off the ground. So I think when they saw that, they're like, "Oh, this looks like a good match."
Well, and you didn't show up to the first meeting, and we all know when you don't show up to the first meeting, you're going to get a job. You're going to assign a job to you in your absence. Okay, you're in charge.
Never miss a meeting.
Yeah, somehow the guy's not here, he's going to get the job. So I want to bring back what you brought up a minute ago about racket. I think it's so. Could you share that quote one more time about organizations moving to rackets?
Every cause starts out as a mission, turns into a business, and ends up as a racket.
So cause start as a mission, turn into a business, end up as a racket. So where would you say CrossCon is now, and what would you say? Let's start with that. Where would you say CrossCon is now? Is it more of a cause that's turned into a mission, or is it a full-fledged organization, business that has success and has been operating for a few years? Would you put it in that second category at this stage?
Oh, I pray not. Gosh, I hope not.
So business in your mind is a bad thing. This cause that starts as a mission.
If it's only existing so that we can make money, yes, get me out of it.
Yeah.
But every organization needs money, so you need faithful stewards. One of my great laments in my life is that men and women who have skills in business don't use it for the church because the world rewards them. But we need those kind of gifts. I mean, in Corinthians, Paul talks about those apostles, gifts to the church, apostles and those who heal people and those who tongues. And he has this term, those who administer or administrating. I was like, why don't we see more business guys looking to build up the church?
Why is that? Why do
The world reward. You can make so much more money. I fear it's a worldliness on our part. And I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm just going to make a lot of money and then I'm going to give it to missions." And it's like, no, you're going to make a lot. Typically, I've run into very few people who did first take care of their own house and their own cars and their, instead of giving to missions. It's really tough.
So let's say you're sitting down with someone and they said, "Matt, 20 years ago, I said to myself and to the Lord, I'm going to go make my money. I'm going to start a business or work for someone or do something, make a lot of money. And then I'm going to give the money to missions. And if I'm being honest, I didn't do that. What should I do now to reverse course?" What would you say to that person?
Well, first of all, I'd take him to Luke 12 and I'd talk to him about the man who built bigger barns, presuming that one day he'd have time to spend all that he'd stored up. So the thought that you're going to make a lot of money and then have time to expend it, well, that's very presumptuous. That's why James says, you need to say, I'm going to go to this city or that city. You need to say, Lord willing. Because you don't know, I could get back on the highway out here and end my life today. But that's the Lord's decision. So you can't presume you're going to have time to spend all that you've accumulated, even if you have good intentions that you're going to spend it on good things.
Not even one more day. Not even one more day.
That's foolish.
Yeah. So what have you done with CrossCon and the planning team of Cross Conference to ensure that this cause that started as a mission doesn't only not turn into a racket, but that it doesn't turn into even a business? What safeguards have you set up, or what values have you put in place to make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, I'm an elder in a local church. I see, and that local church is full of a lot of young people, and I see the need. I see the sin that we're dealing with. I see the challenges of this younger generation that praise God, I didn't have. I mean, if pornography was as available as it is today, I would have probably been consumed by that. It's the grace of God that I haven't been. And so I just want to labor to help this next generation. It's incumbent on my generation to build something for the younger generation. An 18-year-old doesn't know how to pull together a couple $1 million worth of budgets and put together a conference and bring all these speakers and this. It's my generation that has to do that for this next generation. And you know what? In the same way that John Piper was sitting in a missions conference in the 60s, maybe there's another John Piper sitting in our cross conference in 2024. And maybe there's a dozen of them, and maybe there's hundreds of future missionaries there. And I pray there's thousands, because our call on these young people is that everybody has to be a part of the Great Commission. It's not just the tough goers, it's the senders. You have to send these goers. So, I mean, look, I'm not a missions guy in the sense that I'm not a missions expert. I'm a Great Commission guy. And I learned from almost the day I became a Christian, back when I was in college myself, that every Christian is called to be a part of the Great Commission. I don't know if that's me leaving DC and going to Hyderabad, India. The Lord hasn't done that yet. But I got to care about the people who are lost in Hyderabad, that they have an opportunity to hear the gospel in the same way that I did on a campus at the University of Maryland when I was 20 years old.
It seems to me that you have a soberness about your own stewardship. Like, I think it's very interesting when you say, well, I'm not a missions guy, but I'm a Great Commission guy. So maybe what I hear you saying is like, I'm not the guy who's going to get up on stage and talk about missions necessarily, but my life is about the Great Commission. And given the giftings that God has given me, I want to use those, be sober about those giftings, and use those inside the realm of good stewardship to maximize them for the sake of the Great Commission. Would you say that you think about your giftings in respect to the Great Commission, like how I can use my gifts of administration for the sake of playing my part in the Great Commission? Do you think that way?
Not so much now, but certainly did when I was younger. I thought, should I get on the platform or should I just help build the platform? And I had to kind of sort that sense of subjective calling out for myself, I think. But what I'm confident of is that if the Lord has called you to himself, he's poured out his electing love on you, he's also given you gifts that you can exploit for his glory. you just got to figure out what that is.
And you've done some of that work already, so you can just rinse and repeat in every era of your life.
Yeah, I mean, I had a brother call me up and say, I want you to come to our church and preach on in Exodus on honor your father and mother. And I turned him down. And he's like, no, I think you've raised a faithful family. You'd be good to speak to our church on this. And I was like, it would be a really inefficient use of my time. Like, I'll spend 40 hours preparing that sermon.
Yeah.
I got in bed that night, and I told my wife, I said, hey, Garrett called me and said this. And she goes, what'd you say? I said, I turned him down. It's just not a good use of my time. He said, was that the only reason you turned him down? I said, what are you getting at? He said, you tell me. And I said, okay, I'm not sure. I'd be a bit of a hypocrite because I'm not sure I've honored my mother and father, certainly while they were alive. And I know I've not honored them fully after they passed. And it would be a tough sermon to preach. She said, you should preach that sermon. So I texted Garrett from my bed and said, have you found anybody to do that yet?
Undo.
I put 40 hours into that sermon, and it was really good for my soul, which it always is, but it was a lot of time.
Oh, yeah.
So I skipped back to work on Monday. Like, I get to go back and do administration again.
Yeah, there you go.
But the point is, like, the Lord has given you gifts. If all you can do is, I don't know, think of the lowest job that you can think of in your church that would support the gospel going forward, do that. Jesus calls us to be meek, and humble, and he will bless that effort.
I think there's so much value in a young person figuring out not just what they're good at, but what they're not good at. I've heard it said that your 20s are not so much about discovering what to say yes to, but discovering what to say no to. Because it seems like so many people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s are still doing things in which they're quite inefficient. So you talk about preaching a sermon. Certainly there's value in preaching a sermon, but perhaps preaching a sermon every week isn't the best use of your time because you can be maximally efficient elsewhere. And I've discovered, working with a lot of people in their 20s, they're so obsessed with figuring out what to say yes to. What can I say yes to? What am I the best at? It's like, just try some things. Try some things in your careers. Try some things at the local church and figure out what you're good at. And no, that does not mean, I'm really good at speaking, so I should be preaching every weekend. You may not get a chance to preach for 20 years. But figure out how God has wired you, how he's gifted you, and where you can serve him in the context of your local church, and the things that you enjoy. I think certainly God blesses you in the areas that he's equipped you. And it seems like for you, he's blessed you with the gifts of administration. He's also equipped you for those. I mean, what a gift that he's given that to you. You enjoy administration. So for anyone who's in their 20s, and it sounds like you've done this hard work, like, think about your 20s, not just what to say yes to, but what to say no to.
All right, I'm going to tell you something that you'll probably end up cutting. You ready?
Yeah, go.
Cal Newport wrote a book. Everybody probably knows Deep Work.
Deep Work, yeah.
But he also wrote a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You.
I read it because of you a few years ago. Yeah.
So in that book, he argues against this whole passion idea that I just have to find my passion and then go do it. And he says, no, you need to develop your competencies. You need to become a competent person at something. And through that competency, your joy will come to your work. Well, the one thought I had is a verse that goes through my mind probably every week. It's John 9. Jesus said, we must work the work of him who sent us as long as it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. That doesn't say anything about passion. You've got a job to do. I've called you. I poured down my forgiveness and love on you. And there's work to be done because night's coming and all this work's going to end. So I kind of don't care if I have to shovel the snow, which you don't do in California here, or open the doors or build a platform. I don't care what I want to do. There's work to be done to forward the gospel, and that's the only thing that's going to matter at the end of the day. That at the end of that great day, when you stand before Jesus and give an account for your life, there's work to be done.
So do the work, even if you're not passionate about it on day one. And by God's grace, he may bring the passion later. He may not.
Do you know what I was doing this past week before I came to see you?
No, tell me.
I was spending a stupid amount of time trying to figure out how I can feed 10,000 students in the city of Louisville in January.
Was that enjoyable?
It was, no, because these people, you would think, like, we're bringing 10,000 people to your city, you're going to make a lot of money, but
Feed them.
the cooperation is just, it's really tough, just how, so it wasn't very fun, but I'm not doing it because it's fun. I'm doing it so that those kids go in there and they hear the gospel, they hear the call on their lives to be a part of a healthy church, and they hear a call on their lives to be a part of the nations.
Amen.
And taking the gospel to them. So I'll go do food contracts all day long, and I'll do whatever you need me to do. If I can get the chance to preach the gospel, centralize the church, and call you to the nations, give it to me. I'll do it.
Purpose over preference. Yeah.
All the time.
And I believe, by God's grace, that's one of the reasons that Cross Conference will never become a business, but will be a cause that stays as a mission in perpetuity as long as God allows you to do it.
If it does, you'll know I've lost my mind or I'm dead. And I pray the Lord kill me before I would allow it to be something other than what I just said.
Wow, praise God. So I'd like to learn more about how you first got your interest in mission.
And I'm not even suicidal.
So Matt, I'd like to learn more about how you first gained an interest in missions. Like when did missions come on the radar for you? Did you know about that from the time you first became a Christian, or did it come on the radar later?
It was not on the radar for the first 10 years. My church didn't talk about it.
And when did you become a Christian?
1984. I was 22 years old in my last year of college. In fact, I was in a pretty good church that then went what we used to call seeker sensitive, or we might call theotainment. They started just using a lot of entertainment and whatnot. I was like, okay, this is not good. I was a young Christian, but I knew that was not good. In fact, I felt like they compromised the gospel. But I think in my own life, and then what I've seen over the last 30 years in evangelical churches, is as the church becomes healthier, then it's a natural thing to then start looking out and caring about other churches in your city. So if you have a healthy church in your city, but the other 9 churches around you are unhealthy, who's going to win that argument? Who's going to win that witness battle? 9 against 1, they'll win it all the time. So we have to care about other churches being healthy. But then you take that and you go, we're going to go another ring out and go, okay, I don't care just about America. I care about Guatemala, and I care about Nepal, and they haven't had access to access to the gospel. So it just became, I think, as you get healthy, you start looking out to see a healthy person in a healthy church starts caring for others.
And that started to happen for you 10 years after you became a Christian.
Yeah, probably.
Was there a book or a person or a sermon that most influenced you to start thinking differently about global missions, or was it more of a progression over time for you?
Honestly, being introduced to kind of a high view of God, like the glory of God and the purpose that we're created for, and that God intends that to be not just for Matt, but for all people, and every knee will bow. It's like, oh, that also means the Russians and the Chinese and the Vietnamese and just all people. So I think it's just reading my Bible, hearing sermons, getting a bigger view of God's purpose. It's not just to make me comfortable and happy, but for His glory.
How would you describe God's purpose? So what would you say? Do you have a way that you would neatly describe that to someone else who's asking, what is God's purpose? It's for me to be rich, right? Or me to be healthy, or me to be, there's a lot of things people insert into that definition of what they believe God's purpose is. But what would you say is a more biblical approach to and a more biblical view of God's purpose?
Well, I'd probably just send them to Desiring God.
Yeah.
Just go listen to John Piper, because nobody that I've ever known has done it better.
Yeah.
But in short, I would say God is worthy and the creator of all things. And as His creation, I'm called then to image Him on the earth calling other created beings to do the same and bring him glory, reflect his glory back to him. So, yeah, his greatness is to be imaged in a redeemed, sanctified life, imaged back to him. And not just, again, Luke and Matt, but all people everywhere. And when you don't see that, when you see sin, that's not reflecting the reasons he created them. And it's our job to try to help those people.
And the result of that, the result of a life that is submitted to God, committed to others, discovering his glory, it results in Matthew 5:16 that others would see your good works and my good works and give glory to our Father who's in heaven. Yeah. That's the result of that. Good.
And Piper would say, that results in my joy,
Yeah.
which is also, the Heavenly Father is happy. He's happy all the time, right? So if I'm imaging him properly, in that is also joy that is also inexplicable to the sinner or the unbeliever, going, why are you happy in the midst of this world?
Yeah.
Can't explain that. Why do you love someone who doesn't look like you? How do you do that? What? Yeah.
Yeah, it should cause people to ask questions. If they're not asking questions, we may not be doing it right. We may not fully understand how glorious God is and how big the gospel is in spite of our sinfulness.
Yeah, a little example there. I was younger. All 5 of my kids were still at home, and a young woman who we had gotten to know, and we invited her to our table. She was not yet a believer, and at the end of our dinner time, we dismissed the kids, and she looked at me and she goes, "Why do your children happily obey you?" And I was just like, "What?" She goes, "What? They're happy and they obey you." Well, then we got into a great discussion about authority, and in her mind, authority is always bad and misused, and that was her experience with her parents. But no, our Heavenly Father is the ultimate and best and kind and generous and benevolent and right authority. And we're called to reflect that. So if you see happiness and obedience, you're seeing the grace of God live, friend.
No.
Because I'm reflecting it's a diminished level, but a poor level compared to how God treats us. But it is good authority on display there, which is merely a reflection of God's authority in our lives.
I was speaking with a mutual friend the other day, someone we both know, and we asked him, what is the main theme of the Bible? And his response was authority. And later, I was debriefing that with a team member of mine, and we were thinking through the people who we know who have chosen not to follow Christ, though they know about him, grew up in the church, and we were thinking of that answer shared with them, and that would be something that they would not like, that they would reject, right? Oh, it's about authority? Well, I'm not into authority because my view of authority is connected to my family of origin, my father, authority being abused. But authority, when it's God's authority, is the best thing for us. But you're right, we often view authority as a bad thing in our culture and perhaps even globally to an extent. So there's a lot of chatter about what makes missions effective. So as Christians are back on the home front, and there's a missionary from their church that goes overseas, at some point they want to report, understandably, as they should. And then either that missionary or someone from the church inevitably gets on stage and says, here's the report, and they can deem the work at that moment either successful or unsuccessful or something in between. And oftentimes there's considerations about speed, how fast the work is going. There's considerations about metrics, how many people are saved, whether language is being learned, perhaps, those sorts of things. How would you recommend that a church and also a Christian measures effectiveness in cross-cultural missions? What makes it effective in the context of messy missions?
How long did William Carey go without a convert?
7 years.
How long did Jim Elliot live once he hit the jungle?
Not long. A few minutes.
Were these men unsuccessful?
Say Jim Elliot and the 5 that went were successful because of what happened after, across the next few decades, even today. And there are people hundreds of years later who are following Christ in India because of the work of William Carey. So if you're asking me the question, I would say both men were successful. Jim Elliot had a very fast ministry, and not in the way he expected as he was martyred. And William Carey had a very slow ministry in a sense, is 7 years until his first convert, and decades of ministry, and many languages that he translated the Bible into, so that 300 million people could read the Bible in their language. I would say both men were successful, but the profiles look vastly different.
Yeah. William Payton was discouraged. Don't go to the New Hebrides. The cannibals have eaten our last group of missionaries that we sent there. You're going to die. So I don't think the term successful is not the right question or the right word. It's a question of faithfulness. Were these men faithful? Were these women faithful? That's all that matters. Maybe the Lord wanted Jim Elliot's life to end and his journal to survive, because maybe we would never gotten into his journal where we see the often quoted line of, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." Maybe we would never have gotten that idea that launched hundreds, if not thousands, of the generation before my generation into the mission field as a result of that kind of a spirit. Maybe we'd never seen that. So it was in God's providence, Jim Elliot's martyrdom proved faithful. So it's an American obsession, pal, and you know it,
Oh, yeah.
about this number stuff.
Pragmatism.
It's just, if we can't quantify it, it didn't happen. And that's just not true. You need to know that as a father. You're about to have your fourth. I mean, can you imagine putting these sorts of metrics on your family? Honey, it's a bad year. This one didn't get potty trained in time, and this one didn't get all A's, and this one didn't grow as fast as we had hoped, and
She would respond, "What's wrong with you?"
Exactly.
And where did my husband go?
And the church, Christ's church, is so much closer to a family than it is to a business. I get why businesses, their purpose is different than what Christ's church's purpose is. So there might be a little church in Scotland right now of 30 people who are faithfully praying for the Great Commission. I mean, I know of a church in Scotland that for decades prayed that the Berlin Wall would drop and communism would come to an end. And when it happened, that church claimed that it was their prayers to God, and it very well may have been. And yet you've never heard of that church. And they might have never seen another convert, but they prayed faithfully. That's a successful church.
Yeah.
That's because it's a faithful church.
So how would you describe the faithful believer? So we think about, Jim Elliot and William Carey. On paper, perhaps one looks more or less successful than the other, but we're not measuring them based upon check boxes. How would you describe the faithfulness of a Jim Elliot or another missionary, a Peyton or a Amy Carmichael? What do you think faithfulness looks like in their life?
I mean, these people we write about, these that get biographies, the common thing seems to be one of sacrifice. Really a death to self, a willingness or a God-given ability to see this world as temporal, and that all that matters is eternal, and that they were going to gear their life. They see the end. We'll use this kind of language as modern people. They see the end, and they re-engineer, right? What is it called?
Reverse engineer.
Reverse engineer
Yeah.
their lives to the end. If the end, all that we see is gone, and only the supremacy of Christ matters, then I'm going to gear my life according to that. So I was a double major in finance and marketing. And when I became a Christian, I was like, what am I going to do? I couldn't get out of my head that there's got to be more important than making Crest white strips. really popular in America. It's like, what am I going to do? Or that somehow, getting my CPA really mattered. Like, I think the Christian, these faithful Christians, see the end and adjust their lives accordingly, and then labor. Oh, do they labor?
Yeah.
And they don't give up. Steadfastness, endurance, they just go.
Long suffering. They die tired. Yeah.
I mean, I think of Titus 2:2 a lot. Sober-minded, self-controlled, steadfast. So, oh, that in our age we might have sober-minded 20-year-old men. That we might have women who aren't looking at TikTok and care the length of their eyelashes, but instead are deeply devoted to their husbands and their children, and the family being the greatest educational institute, not Harvard, the family being that, and that these women would give of their lives to seeing another generation raised up to walk with the Lord. Oh, let that be the case.
So Harvard, speaking of an organization that started as a cause, moved into a mission, and then into a business, and then turned into a racket. So as you well know, living on the East Coast, Harvard started as a seminary and had a mission statement with Jesus Christ in it. And then they became too progressive. So, of course, on their heels, Yale started. And Yale started as another seminary because, Harvard had gone off the rails.
Yeah.
And look what happened to Yale. So to harken back to your example just a minute ago about these causes turning into rackets, we've seen that with both of those schools, sadly.
And I can't remember where he graduated from. It was Harvard or Yale. David Brainerd, the missionary to the Native Americans in the Northeast. He was kicked out because he challenged a professor, didn't think the professor was actually converted.
Oh, wow.
And he was kicked out. He never did get his degree, as if I recall the story correctly. And instead he went into missions into the Northeast. And there we have his journal, which Jonathan Edwards then, after his death, put into that book, and generations have profited from. So there again, a really interesting turn there. God had a purpose. He never got a degree, but he was faithful and used mightily.
Oh, praise God. I didn't know that. So what would you say are some of the more effective works being done in missions today? As you look around the landscape, what are the ministries or people or causes that you say are maximally having an outsized impact on global missions?
Those who are most closely tied to the centrality of the church. The missions doesn't need to take place if you've got a faithful church in a city. Self-sustaining, indigenous-led, faithful church. We don't need to send missionaries there anymore. Until you get that, missions exist in that city or that people group.
So in other words, the only reason a people group needs a missionary to come to them is precisely because they don't have a local church or a healthy local church in that place that can evangelize their own people.
I love the fact that people want to bring clean water. Christians want to bring clean water to a countryside. But we have a different kind of water that we're offering. One that you will never thirst again. And so I want that kind of water pouring through that city or that countryside. That's what we labor for. Do that and then move on.
Christians care about all suffering, especially eternal suffering.
suffering.
I remember hearing that for the first time at Cross Conference when John Piper spoke, and that's always stuck with me. I think it's helped me to explain the value in humanitarian work. It's not useless. Jesus, he acted in ministry with humanitarian work. He fed the 5,000. That's a humanitarian need that's being met.
He healed the woman who was bleeding for 12 years.
Right. But he also, usually after that, he healed them spiritually or gave them an opportunity to have their soul healed as well.
What's the quote? Preach the gospel, if necessary, use words.
Oh, yeah.
Hogwash.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hogwash.
Yeah.
You've not preached the gospel until you've opened your mouth.
That's right.
So this notion that I'm just going to go, to see the city prosper or something like that, it's like, okay, that's better than putting out porn as a porn producer. Okay, great, let's do that. But that's not the call of a Christian.
So the quote, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words. We could make that better by saying, meet physical need, meet spiritual need, use words. Like something like that, right? Nothing wrong with meeting physical need. Do it. It's a good thing. We care about human suffering. But especially meet spiritual need and use your words. You know, by God's grace, words need to be used. That is clear throughout all of Scripture.
The only reason Luke Womack and Matt Schmucker are here as followers of Christ is because somebody told us about our sin and the one person who could remove it. They had to tell us.
That's right. That was my father. Yeah, growing up, my father came into the room every night and read a Bible story to my brother and I and shared the gospel with us countless times. Driving to school, my father would say, from the Proverbs, I think it's Proverbs 1, my son, when sinners entice you, do not consent. He was constantly reminding me of my sin and the one person who could save me. So yes, that is true in everyone's life. And if we're being honest with ourselves, it's true in our lives as well for those who are saved. Someone brought the gospel to you with their mouth, with words. So yes, it is necessary to use words. Let's not stop doing that.
Your dad sounds like a successful dad.
I would say so. There you go. There you go. And it wasn't fast, I can tell you that. It definitely wasn't fast. Yeah, it took an act of God. So I want to just close by asking you about Good Churches. So Good Churches is a ministry you launched recently. Tell us about what you do and how people can get involved if they want to learn about Good Churches.
Goodchurches.org. You'll find it black and white, a lot of words, nothing fancy. I am concerned that there are, so I like you, I'm concerned that we as people in the United States who have all the resources in the world and all the opportunities, that we do send Western missionaries. There are strategic places to send Western missionaries, where being, white or a Westerner is actually an advantage. There are places where it's actually a disadvantage. And there's a particular place in the world where, and I don't publicly name the location, but there are well over 1,000 unreached peoples, almost like hundreds of millions of people that just the country is closed. There's persecution. You every time I travel there, with every year, it gets more dangerous for the people that I'm seeing, because my white face attracts the wrong kind of attention. They will get persecuted, and there are real risks. The gospel conversion's been outlawed in this particular state that has 200 million people in it. If a pastor's caught baptizing somebody, it's 6 months automatic jail. So to send a Western missionary in there, by the way, the language is really, really hard. The environment is really, really nasty due to pollution and all kinds of things, overcrowding. The failure rate is essentially 100%. I mean, most don't make it through their first term. The average person, it costs to put one couple in this location is $100,000 a year. The average cost...
You're saying a Western missionary.
A Western missionary. To send a Western missionary, the average cost $100,000 a year. To train... Now, what is that average missionary going to need to do? Well, he or she needs to learn the language. Well, how long is that going to take? It's at least 3 years.
5 years.
Just to make your way around the market, let alone getting into the nuances of scripture and heart language kind of stuff. So they need training, and they go there, and they spend their first 3+ years in training, but most of them kick out, and they're back home in Nebraska or in New Jersey thinking they've done something for missions, and in fact...
And the investment has been $300,000 to $500,000 in them.
Yes,
perhaps.
And everyone back home thinks that they were missionaries and they did a lot of stuff, but they in fact didn't. They were there, they were pretty isolated, and they spent all their time training. What if you took that same amount of money and time and invested it into pastoral training of the locals? Because they also need training. They just need theological training. They already have the language. They already have the cultural sensitivities. They're there legally. They're used to the environment. This is home. They're not going anywhere. They just need theological training. Well, the average single man costs us $2,500 a year.
A year.
Room, board, tuition. A married guy basically doubles. So we can train 20 guys, 20 indigenous guys for the same price as that one missionary. So if half of our guys fail, let's say, I still got 10 guys who are now being launched as pastors while your one missionary is back home in Pennsylvania thinking he's done something. So I've got my administrator mind on, I got my finance head on, and I'm going, wait, we can keep throwing Western missionaries into this environment and they keep getting sent home, and we can keep pumping millions of dollars into this environment and it just and nothing to show. Or we can finally do something that's going to not be fast. We're not apostles of speed here. It's slow, steady training of faithful men who will go out then and plant faithful churches. That was a long answer.
That was a great answer. So people can get involved primarily through giving to good churches at goodchurches.org, and through that website they can get in contact with you.
Yeah.
And you also can connect them directly with the end user, right? Because there's risk of security, so it's not for everyone, but for those who are interested in sending kingdom dollars to a place where the gospel is a little bit, and there's people on the ground who are training pastors to go out in a very hostile environment, they can invest with goodchurches.org. Is that right?
Yep.
Great. I love the work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
It's wonderful. And then final question, I just want to ask about CrossCon. So CrossCon is going on this is your 6th conference?
Something like that.
So in 2024, January 3rd to 5th, in Louisville, Kentucky. So who is this for? And if people want to attend, what's the best way to get involved with CrossCon?
Well, our target audience is really 18 to 25-year-olds. Now, 90% of the people who show up don't sign themselves up. Group leaders sign them up. So college pastors, church leaders, that sort of thing. So I really want to talk to the pastors out there and the group leaders. Like, you've got an opportunity to bring your students, bring your 18 to 25-year-olds, and hear the gospel clearly preached, talk about the church, and then give a heart for the nations. It's 3 days. It's honestly one of my favorite conferences. Yeah. Just the singing is great. There's just thousands of people that are your age, and because often I think when you're an 18 to 25-year-old, you feel like you're all alone in the world anyhow. And suddenly you're in a room with thousands of other ones who are just praising the Lord and taking in this great teaching and the fellowship. This is really you can, I think when I was at that age, you can really move the needle in a 3-day conference and go and kind of reset your trajectory.
So for church leaders, for college ministers, campus pastors, that sort of thing, bring a group of 18 to 25-year-olds. And obviously being in person is ideal. But if someone wants to join virtually, you also have a virtual offering as well where people can log in.
Yeah, it's free. You can simulcast it, but
cool.
we don't edit it and make it all fancy or anything. It's just okay. It's on.
You get what you get.
We want them to come because to be in the room it's a lot different.
Well, we pray that God blesses CrossCon and your work with good churches.
CrossCon.com. You'll see all the speakers. It's a great lineup. I can't wait for it.
Wonderful. We can't either. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate your time.
Blessings.